The insanity of it is this, that the most important single factor in being a human being is our consciousness. Mm-hmm. And these guys claim that it's an accidental byproduct of chemical reactions.
Absolutely.
In the brain, right?
Yeah.
Well, how can you, I mean, it seems to me so patently absurd. How can you put that into words?
It's really hard to understand, and I've said this many times that I think in the not very distant future, a lot of historians and sociologists of science are going to make a good living trying to figure out why it's taken science so long to catch on to the fact that this stuff is everywhere.
Well, don't forget.
John Cleese in conversation with Professor Edward Kelly from the University of Virginia, USA. The British actor, who is very interested in ideological questions, comes to an almost unbelievable conclusion. Natural science, as we know it today, conceives human consciousness as a byproduct of chemical reactions in the brain. An assumption which is, generally speaking, hardly questioned. Yet, abundant phenomena indicate that in fact, human consciousness is possible without the body, without the brain.
Bewusstsein wird meist mit Verstand und Intellekt gleichgesetzt.
Most of the time, consciousness is being equated with mind and intellect. The mind is not consciousness, though. It is rather a tool used by consciousness. Were it to be possible to prove that consciousness is insubstantial, then experiences outside the body and life after death would be supposable. But are there convincing scientific approaches that could do that? We began to search for scientists who do not perceive phenomena of consciousness as irrelevant, but actually study them scientifically. The Bender Institute of Neuroimaging at the Justus Liebig University in Gießen, Germany. Ulrich Ott, neuroscientist and psychologist, researches here what occurs in the human brain according to certain states of consciousness. In order to enlighten the coherences between psychological processes and neural activities, the Institute provides a magnetic resonance imaging system, a powerful 3 Tesla Prisma scanner, which enables one to witness brain activities in living people. All magnetic items have to be taken off even before entering the scanning room. A lot has been studied here already, like learning and mindfulness processes, pain processing, or phenomena of altered states of consciousness. On the one hand, the studies at Bion serve fundamental research. But on the other hand, they are a matter of applied clinical research into such things as anxiety disorder treatments. Today, Ulrich Ott demonstrates firstly what is made visible by the scanner during normal testing. The door to the magnetic resonance imager is being closed, and the secrets under the human skull cap should be revealed on the screen. I'm beginning with the first measurement. Here we have the first anatomical recording that enables one to see the brain structures pretty well. It starts there. In here you can see the white matter with the fiber tracts, and around that a grey fringe where the nerve cells are located, the grey cells. I'm going to move further through the brain. Now the eyeball appears right here, and here is the cerebellum, which is crucial for motor function. Now we're pretty much in the middle of the brain. Here we see the spinal cord and the bridge. Up here we can see a white structure. This is the fiber bundle, which connects the right and left hemispheres, the corpus callosum. One can also recognize all of the individual structures of the cortex: prefrontal, frontal, occipital, and parietal. If one moves even further through the brain, up at the front, the temporal lobe appears. On the side, where we hear. So these are the main brain structures. We moved from one ear to the other one. Let's move to the other side quickly. There you can notice the individual structures in a very high resolution of around 1 millimeter. For many years, Ulrich Ott has been especially interested in the question of whether and how altered consciousness states during meditation manifest themselves in brain activities. What insights did he discover from his observations? Does lived spirituality indeed show itself in the brain?
Ja, man kann sehr schön sehen, dass wenn jemand meditiert,
one can clearly see that a person who is meditating also activates certain networks in the brain for that. Which ones these are does depend on the type of meditation that's being practiced. It isn't surprising. If I mentally repeat a mantra, for instance, Om, which is a well-known one, or a little longer in yoga, Om Namah Shivaya, or if I use a word like stillness, peace, or release, then I produce language in doing so. Right-handed people's motor speech area, the Broca's area, is located in the left hemisphere up here, and it's being activated while doing that. Moreover, I can see, for example, that if someone draws their attention to their breath, then the attention network is required and that they need to inhibit the activity of certain other networks associated with daydreaming and losing oneself in thought. Therefore, we can see a highly differentiated pattern of activation and deactivation in the brain. A third area, which can also be seen quite well, is when people practice meditation where they cultivate certain feelings inside, like compassion or loving kindness. Interestingly enough, these are regions of body perception. The somatosensory cortex, and especially the insular cortex, which are a representation of our inner organs in the brain. This means we actually feel those feelings physically. That's why, for example, the heart is associated with love, while sorrow or anger, that's in the gut, or fear, that contracts one's intestines. All of them are perceptions of the body, attended by emotions. So, if I cultivate something like compassion and kindness within me, then it is also a physical representation in the brain which is being activated.
Das, was man aus dem alltäglichen Sprachgebrauch kennt.
So, expressions used in everyday language, for example, a big-hearted person, a bad gut feeling, or having anger in your belly, would be confirmed by that? Exactly.
Sie haben von der Aktivierung
You have talked about the activation of certain brain regions. Simply put, does that mean that a person who practices certain types of meditation on a regular basis becomes more empathic?
Ja, also das Gehirn.
Yes. Well, the brain is plastic. It has the ability to change. If I practice something regularly over a longer period of time, then it will have an impact on brain structure. That's not only the case with meditation. It also applies to learning an instrument or a new language. It changes the structures in the brain that are needed for that. So it's the same with meditation, given that we witness that the structures which are being acutely trained there during practice are developed better in the long run. This means practicing the ability to hold my focus and, whenever it wanders away, noticing that and bringing myself back. Or something you've just mentioned. I cultivate this emotion and it surpasses meditation as an ability, noticeable in day-to-day life. For instance, connecting with what other people feel. Like many others, Ulrich Ott's studies show that there are definite correlations between brain functions and consciousness states. But do these correlations also prove that the brain is producing consciousness? Can people who are in a coma consciously perceive something? The philosopher and psychologist Joachim Nicolai has dealt extensively with this question.
Das künstliche Koma wird von Ärzten manchmal als Heilschlaf bezeichnet.
A medically induced coma is sometimes called healing sleep by doctors. Thus, it is assumed that people cannot perceive anything in this state. Indeed, many do say in retrospect that it was just like a black hole, and that they do not have any memory of it. But there is a series of cases where experiences have occurred. I do want to emphasize experiences, which are on the one side very terrifying in nature, and on the other side very positive, namely near-death experiences.
Erlebnisse, nämlich Nahtoderfahrungen auf der anderen Seite.
What kind of terrifying experiences are there, for example? I held a seminar about this topic, near-death experiences and other experiences during coma. There happened to be people there who have experienced it in this form. They came to me afterwards and said, one has to imagine it being like a nightmare to the power of 10. It's not just a nightmare, it's much worse. It truly is a horror trip. That is because nightmares are reminiscent of dreams, and dreams are sort of damped, but these experiences during coma are totally realistic. People do experience it as if it happened in real life. The negative aspects are, for example, well, there are different topics to it. For instance, fighting for survival that mirrors the situation of this severe illness. Often there are experiences of a lack of freedom. This means that people have the feeling of being trapped. Like the person from the seminar said, I was sitting in a very narrow pyramid and couldn't escape it. Or they walk through labyrinths, are looking for the exit, but can't find it. These experiences mirror the exact state of where these people are at that moment.
Der Zustand, in dem die Menschen sich in dem Moment befinden, das ist ein Zustand.
It is a state of bondage. They're being hindered from waking up due to anesthesia, and they're being hindered from making contact with their surroundings. They cannot communicate with anyone, and they cannot escape this prison, and that is being reflected in some drastic images. Sometimes people do partially perceive what is happening on the intensive care unit, like if someone's talking to them. Then the nurses, for example, become the guards in this prison. They're being implemented into these scenes and become people who are overwhelming them and keeping them trapped. These are two themes, the fight for survival and the lack of freedom.
Das Überleben, die Unfreiheit, und dann gibt's ein Thema.
Then there is another topic, which could be called the fear of decompensation. That is, if one looks at these scenarios and begins to believe that this is a permanent condition. People can't escape that. Where does this lead? There are some statements from people who said, I was afraid of losing myself.
Da habe ich wahnsinnige Angst vor gehabt.
I was really scared of forgetting who I am, where I am, and what's happening to me.
Was mit mir los ist.
Some coma experiences are quite blissful, like classical near-death experiences. The American neurosurgeon, Eben Alexander, was a convinced materialist, but one day he fell into a coma himself, which enabled him to access another reality.
And that's where I ascended in that portal and found myself in this beautiful, ultra-real Gateway Valley. Many Earth-like features. There was a beautiful meadow, tremendous forest, lush plant life, blossoms, buds on trees, and all this dynamic life. There were no signs of any death or decay anywhere. This was an absolutely beautiful kind of vision of this earthly valley. There were thousands of beings down below me dancing in joy and merriment. When I wrote it all up, weeks later, when I came out of coma, I called them souls between lives, because that's what it struck me was their kind of identity and role in this whole drama.
That's what you thought they were, or
Exactly. I mean, that's what I called them in coming back to this world, and I think that's still a very apt description. Now, I never had any bodily awareness. There was never any kind of human body awareness at all during this entire journey. But I was aware. I was a speck of an observer. And this observer was on a butterfly wing, and there were millions of butterflies in these looping in vast spiraling formations, colors beyond the rainbow, beyond description. And the best part about all of this journey was in this beautiful world of perfection, really, a world of ideals in so many ways. I was not alone. There was a beautiful young woman beside me on the butterfly wing. And I'll never forget her sparkling blue eyes and high cheekbones, high forehead, soft brown hair. She was dressed in the same very simple garb that all those beings dancing in the valley down below had on, but they all had colors, again, so rich, so far beyond our description. It was just an amazingly beautiful world. But her message to me, I believe, was the central message. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear.
Critics questioned the neurosurgeon's statements. Psychologist and neuroscientist Bruce Greyson analysed the case.
Well, one of the complaints lodged against him by his critics is that he had several malpractice suits filed against him, and they concluded that he was a liar because he wasn't being honest about those. In matter of fact, Eben Alexander was a neurosurgeon, and the neurosurgeons have one of the highest rates of malpractice suits of any medical specialty. It's rare to find a neurosurgeon who doesn't have several malpractice suits filed against him. So that is not something you can really hold against him. But the more telling issues were that people claimed that he wasn't really near death, that what he said was a coma was actually medically induced by drugs that were given him because he was so agitated to calm him down. Now, being a skeptic, I wasn't about to take his word at face value, but I also wasn't willing to take the skeptic's words at face value. So I, with his permission, got his hospital to send me his medical record, which is more than 600 pages long. And I made copies, and I evaluated one copy, and two other doctors independently evaluated the other two copies. And what we found, all three of us independently, was that he was indeed in a near-death state. He went into a deep coma before he was given any medications. And in fact, he came out of the coma while he was still having those medications. So the medications were not related to his coma at all. Furthermore, sequential CAT scans, computerized axial tomography of his brain showed that his skull looked like it was filled with mush. You couldn't make out any structure of the brain at all. And it seemed impossible for him to have complex thinking and perceptions while he was in that state. His doctors gave him a 1% chance of survival, and they didn't expect him to be able to function at all if he did manage to survive. And yet,
did they write that down? Or
yes.
How would you know?
That appears in the medical records. Yeah. In fact, they did not even bother to measure his brain waves because they assumed he was a dead man and there's nothing they could do to help him. So they just kind of kept him alive by feeding him through IV tubes. And then after 6 days, to their surprise, he woke up. And it took him a while to get back his memories and his verbal abilities. But he remembered vividly this near-death experience, which has some verifiable aspects. He was able to remember looking down on his hospital room and seeing certain things that occurred at certain days during his hospitalization, and we can verify which days they occurred. And when you look at the medical records, you see there are measures of his depth of coma, the Glasgow Coma Scale done by every nursing shift, and he showed very severe brain damage at the time when he was having these accurate perceptions.
Coma experiences, near-death experiences. Consciousness without brain? Where could consciousness come from if not from the brain? Did consciousness exist before matter, as some people assume?
Ja, also ich bin von meiner Ausrichtung her ein Psychophysiologe.
Well, I am a psychophysiologist, and as such, I have experience, physiological measurements, and behavior standing as equals next to each other. These are the three planes that I can examine, and I observe coherences. But I am not saying that one generates the other, and would therefore have something like primacy. It kind of depends on how one approaches it. Obviously, if I primarily observe the brain as an organ and look at the activities it generates, which I can influence experimentally, for instance with transcranial magnetic stimulation, then I will come to the conclusion that if I give an impulse here, then this action will occur. Of course, I could then have the idea that it has primacy, like the hardware is primary and the consciousness that comes from it is an emergent phenomenon. All of these are attempts to describe it. In reverse, if I intensely study consciousness and do meditation and then notice that the conception of matter, of this body and my view of the world, is just an image, a construction, a creation, then I am of course more likely to say that consciousness is primary and everything else is derived from it. Both perspectives can be taken and I view them as complementary. I can either look from the third-person perspective on the happenings, or I can do it from the first-person perspective. They complement each other wonderfully, in my opinion. I wouldn't want to make a decision here. There is matter. I think it is extremely implausible to say that the world is nothing but a fantasy. Nor does the existence of matter depend on consciousness, because many people have already died and the world itself hasn't changed much through that, at least for me in my perspective. There is a material base. On the other hand, I do believe that what the mind or consciousness is capable of, the depths of consciousness, are often being vastly underrated. Some scientists are convinced that today's common naturalistic worldview is inadequate for exploring consciousness. In the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, USA, many researchers think that materialism has to be overcome.
I could talk about lots of things, but the thing I think is most important for this meeting is to try to put the kind of work that we do at DOPS into a bigger perspective. Clearly, the question, what happens when we die, is a rather big one. Most of us would like to know the answer to that. And a lot of our work has been focused on that subject. But our work is really part of a much bigger thing that is gathering momentum as we sit here and talk. And it has to do with a kind of worldview that has emerged over the last several centuries, particularly in the past century or so, and really kind of taken over, and in particular taken over central parts of the scientific establishment, in particular the kind of folks I work. I'm a psychologist by training, experimental psychologist, also have done a lot of neuroscience. Psychologists and neuroscience are totally committed, with few exceptions, to this kind of picture that I'm about to describe to you. And we think that picture is basically false, and we're trying to overturn it.
The radical statement is, science, which is courted by the public, simply ignores phenomena that do not fit into the established worldview, and that involves many phenomena of consciousness.
So we have this kind of attitude towards scientists, not just doctors, but scientists in general. And the fact is that if they come across something they can't explain, they pretend it really doesn't exist, right?
You bet. I mean, the kind of stuff that we study challenges deeply held beliefs of many mainstream scientists. And some can tolerate that, and some really can't. I mean, it's like a religious thing, you know, it's like...
It's exactly like a religious thing.
Secular
It's like a heresy in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, heresy in the temple of science.
And they take the attitude a bit like Galileo standing there with his telescope, right, and the scholastics there, and he's saying, would you please look through my telescope and you'll see the craters on the moon, and they're saying, we don't need to look through the telescope because we know they're not there. I mean, that's pure insanity, but it's a caricatured form of what you're up against all the time.
And there are people out there who made careers out of being professional skeptics, and they're often very poorly informed.
Well, they don't bother to read the literature, do they?
Absolutely.
They sort of say, we don't need to read the literature because we know it's rubbish.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you're doing stuff here, you you're a bit famous here for imposing very rigorous scientific procedures.
We do our best.
Bruce Greyson works at the University of Virginia too. He is also the co-founder of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. What are his views on the interaction between mind and brain?
Well, yeah, I was trained, as most doctors were, to believe that the mind is what the brain does, and that all our thoughts and perceptions are created by the brain. The more I studied near-death experiences, the less that model made sense. It just did not explain what was happening, because there were times when the brain seemed to be offline, or at least severely compromised, when consciousness, our thinking and our feeling and our perceptions were more vivid than ever. That just did not make sense if the brain is creating all our thoughts and feelings and perceptions. So I tend to think that there is some dualistic process going on here, where there is a separate part of us that thinks and feels. You can call it the mind, you can call it the soul, whatever you want to call it, that's separate from the brain. This is not a new idea. It goes back to Hippocrates 2,000 years ago, who wrote that the brain is the messenger or the interpreter of the mind. And I think one of the models that's often used now is the idea that the mind is out there somewhere, and the brain's job is to filter the mind, much the way a radio tuner filters out radio waves. There are thousands of radio stations out there. If you tried to listen to all of them at once, you wouldn't be able to understand any of it. So the radio tuner selects one particular station that you want to listen to and filters out all the rest. And the idea is that the brain does that also. The brain is an organ like every other organ in our body that evolved to help us survive in the physical world. So the brain filters out those cognitive contents of our mind that are not relevant to survival, things like seeing deceased loved ones and communicating with the divine. You don't need those to find food and shelter and a mate. So it filters those ideas out and just lets in those thoughts that are relevant to survival. That's not surprising. Our eyes do that. Our ears do that. They just let in those stimuli that are essential to our survival. We don't see all the electromagnetic spectrum. We don't hear all the frequencies, just those that are important to surviving. And then when you are in a compromised state and your brain is failing, that filtering function gets lost or gets weakened. And all these other contents of our mind come flooding in, like seeing deceased loved ones and functioning outside the body. The near-death experience is one example of the mind functioning when the brain is not, but it's not the only one. Another example is terminal lucidity, in which people who have end-stage dementia, such as Alzheimer's disease, suddenly become completely lucid again after they've been unable to recognize family or communicate for months or sometimes years, shortly before they die. And there's no medical explanation for this. One theory is that this is the brain's filtering stopping, so that the mind can then function again. Now, as you mentioned, this raises the question of how this non-physical mind interacts with the physical brain. And I have no idea how that could happen. On the other hand, if you believe the conventional model that the brain creates the mind, we have no idea how that could happen. No one has ever come up with an idea of how a chemical or electrical process in the brain can create a thought or a feeling.
There are numerous ideas, parables and theories, but a new science-oriented worldview is currently not in sight. But consciousness phenomena suggest that somehow there must be more than just visible and measurable brain processes in order to explain that we are able to experience the world as we do.
think something's going on. And if people say, well, that's a bit woolly, isn't it? I want to say, look at quantum physics, which is the best description we have of our reality. And you find particles that affect other particles simultaneously at huge distances apart. One particle affects another particle simultaneously. And it appears sometimes that things move backwards in time. Well, if anybody said that normally, the people would come with the flapping white coats, but they don't because they're quantum physicists. So we believe them. We don't know what it means or anything, but the answer is quantum physics is deeply worrying. I think Niels Bohr said that when you approach quantum physics for the first time, if you're not shocked, you didn't understand it. So if the reality of quantum physics, which is the best description we got of this life we live in, is so strange, why should an afterlife question like that be straightforward and simple? So I think something's going on, but I think the problem is we don't really have much of a clue.
This is true, and a lot of mainstream scientists actually ridicule us for making these kinds of connections, not being quantum theorists ourselves and so on. And there's some justice in that, I have to say. It's too easy to make those kind of links. Arthur Kessler even made a joke about it, that the argument is basically there's this weird stuff going on in psychical research, there's this weird stuff going on in quantum mechanics, maybe the two are connected somehow. But it really does go further than that. The quantum world is much more hospitable somehow to these strange things than certainly the Newtonian world.
Which, you know, explained an enormous amount for 350 years, but now there's some things that it doesn't explain, and the new vision, quantum physics, does. So the idea that the explanation is going to be very straightforward is inherently ridiculous.
No, I agree. And it's really important to emphasize that we're not trying to overthrow mainstream science. It's great as far as, it's a fantastic human achievement, it really is. And it's easy to lose sight of that. It's just that it doesn't explain everything. And we have to expand it somehow in order to accommodate these additional phenomena.
Gut, so dann hole ich sie mal wieder raus.
Well, I'm going to let her out again.
Also es gibt eine sehr schöne...
There was a very nice seminar at the German Buddhist Union regarding the topic, what is mind? I think mind is a very nice term that can be used to pin down this question. The term mind is usually used to explain a mental or spiritual level. Now, there is this interesting phenomenon in all cultures because they all talk about ghosts, which are dissociated from a physical body and are viewed as being something altogether perceptible.
Ja, und das durchaus als etwas gesehen wird, was wahrnehmbar ist.
Sometimes it's waved aside as a kind of primitive approach to world perception. Like if one isn't quite sure how lightning occurs, then one sees a deity or some sort of nature being and views everything as alive. Whereas actually, a current study shows how meditating people report their perception of beings, non-physical beings. A presence that they feel, which sometimes can be felt in certain spaces or places.
Die manchmal auch an bestimmten Räumen, an bestimmten Orten wahrnehmbar sind.
Of course, one can brush that aside as nonsense, fantasies. But for those meditating who were sensing that, the evidence is there, so they say, I perceive it as just as real as, say, this table. Obviously, I can touch the table, unlike the spirit, but I sense the quality. There is a quality of perception, and I don't want to deny my perception. And if there are several people who start to talk about it and say, oh, what did just happen here? Then the evidence accumulates that there was indeed something present. According to my own personal experience, I am strongly convinced that these phenomena do exist, and that consciousness can exist separately from matter. With his books, Ulrich Ott builds bridges from science to spirituality. The topic, mind and spirits, is at the center of research by another scientist. Prompted by his own experiences, IT business engineer Oliver Lazar from Düsseldorf, Germany, initiated a comprehensive study of the value of mediums' messages passed from the other side. A scientific, pioneering work.
There have been done already a few studies, but not many. Such studies aren't necessarily published in scientific journals, but are more or less published in books or on the internet. But there have been done some studies that can be taken seriously. Some of them were done 100 years ago or longer. There was even a doctoral thesis that dealt with this in the 1930s. And the scale that we are dealing with here in our Irium study is an absolute novelty, because we worked with 243 participants.
What does the name Iriums mean?
It's an acronym for Empirical Research of the Effectiveness and Authenticity of Messages from Spirit. It's got to do with my days at Fraunhofer. When I worked at Fraunhofer Institute, every scientific project had such an acronym. And I just continued this approach with our study.
Regarding his Iriums study, Oliver Lazar worked together with several people, one of whom is the psychic medium Bettina Sufi Rode. Amongst other things, it was about whether mediums' messages actually contain highly specific information, which could not possibly be known to the medium themselves. The results were impressive. More than 90% of the participants stated, clearly yes. More than 2/3 of the initially not verified mediums' messages could be positively verified within 3 to 4 weeks. But, maybe the most impressive, around 82% of the participants stated that the afterlife contact was very comforting for them.
You have to envision that we were also dealing with people who were severely grieving, with parents who had lost their children. And anyone who has ever had to deal with such people knows that there is nothing in the world that could comfort these people. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And when these people tick the top box of the questionnaire and say, that was very comforting, then this has a certain significance. Critics often say, yes, well, the parents who have lost their child want to be comforted. They want to receive messages. It's obvious that they tick the box at the top. But that's not true. And that's what our psychotherapist, who has been working with these people for over 20 years, said. She knows exactly what these people feel and think. She says that there is no one more critical than parents who have lost a child. You can't just come and say, your child is here, he says he loves you, and then the parents would say, oh, that was comforting. No, they only say that it was comforting if it was authentic.
Now, there are two main theories in science regarding consciousness. The, let's say, mainstream theory assumes that the brain generates consciousness. Other theories, which are mainly common in near-death research, assume that the brain is only a filter, a receiver of consciousness. What is your view regarding this question?
Es gibt da eine schöne Geschichte, die das sehr bildhaft darstellt, wie ich mir das vorstelle, nämlich
There is a beautiful story that illustrates how I envision it. Let's say I'm listening to a wonderful song on the radio, and I'd like to know what the origin of this song is. So I'm doing some research. How would a materialistic scientist start here? He or she looks at the radio and then asks the question, what actually happens in the radio? He or she puts the radio through a tomograph and then determines there are certain parts in the radio that are particularly in motion and particularly active when the song is played. And now the scientist says, aha, the loudspeaker's membrane vibrates, the component gets hot, so that's where the song originates from. That's a bit of a comparison to today's science and brain research and consciousness research. Functional magnetic resonance imaging is used to see which areas of the brain are active when you have certain feelings. This works very well. So you can really wonderfully determine which areas of the brain are active when you are shown photos of your lover, for example. Especially the limbic system plays a big role in this. But now the big mistake is made in science, namely that increased activity is equated with the origin. So now they say, because this area of the brain is active, the feeling must come from there. But it's not the same with the radio. Just because we find activity doesn't mean that this is the origin of it. But if we trace it back, I realize, aha, there's a radio station somewhere that broadcasts this. And if I go further, I find the composer who wrote this song. So whenever I trace the whole thing back, I'll never get to a material process, and I'll never get to matter. When I trace it back to the origin, I'll always find a creative spirit.
The spirit. Is the spirit something insubstantial which connects with the material body, which incarnates? And maybe incarnates not only once? Professor Jim Tucker from the University of Virginia has found evidence for that. The American child psychiatrist has collected several thousand well-studied cases in which children report incidents that could have occurred in past lives. He also thinks that consciousness doesn't necessarily have to be bound to a brain.
Well, I think the idea would be there may be sort of a larger consciousness, a larger self that then inhabits a physical brain and inhabits experiences a lifetime, but that is not constrained by that lifetime, that it comes before and exists after. So the experience that we have during a life is perhaps only one experience that's part of this larger consciousness.
Tell us one of the best research cases, just to show what the possibilities are.
Well, one that I studied was a little boy named Ryan who started talking about a life in Hollywood when he was 4 years old, and he would beg and cry and beg his mother to take him to Hollywood.
Where did he live?
He was in Oklahoma. So eventually she got some books out of the public library about Hollywood to try to help him kind of process this. And they were looking through one of them one day, and they got to a picture from an old movie called Night After Night. And he pointed to one of the guys and said, "Hey, Mama, that's George. We did a picture together." And then he pointed to another person and said, "And that's me. I found me." Now, the first person he pointed to was George Raft, who was a well-known actor back in the day.
Famous, yeah.
But the other one he pointed to that he said he had been was an extra with no lines in the movie. So Ryan's mom wrote to me to see if I could help figure out who this person was. And as we were working on it, she was sending me emails sometimes on a daily basis with all of these statements that Ryan was making, so we got documentation of everything he was saying. And then eventually, with the help of a Hollywood archivist, we were able to find out who this person was. This archivist went to the library of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, got all the materials on this movie Night After Night, and there was one shot that included him and gave his name, a guy named Marty Martin. And Ryan had described quite a life, which, to be honest, I thought was unlikely for an extra with no lines in a movie. But it fit Marty Martin's life. So Ryan said how he had danced in New York, and Marty Martin danced on Broadway. Ryan said that he then went and worked in the movies, which Marty Martin did, mostly working on dance in the movies. He said that he then worked at an agency, and Marty Martin started a successful talent agency. He described this life of going to Europe on ships and so forth, which Marty Martin did. He also said that the street address of his house had the word Rock or Mount in it, and Marty Martin lived on North Roxbury. And then also one time he said he didn't see why God would let you get to 61 and then come back again as a baby. And Marty Martin's death certificate actually said he was 59, but when I looked into it, I found census records and marriage listings and passenger lists that all gave ages, which meant, in fact, he was 61 when he died and not 59. So altogether, we were able to verify that over 50 of Ryan's statements matched Marty Martin's life. And Marty Martin was an obscure person who died in 1964, and then...
So there was no information anywhere about him until you started to dig.
Well, that's right. And now there is more on the internet because of this case, but at the time there was nothing on Marty Martin on the internet.
But how should this larger mind show itself without a brain? How does it differ from body-connected consciousness of self?
The personality that each of us has, we know is affected by things like genetics and certainly things like environmental events that happen before the life. The question is there also something that, are we a complete blank slate as we come in, or is there this larger personality or a larger mind that also affects how we are in this life? And again, I think our cases argue strongly that there is this aspect of mind that predates the personality I have now. And perhaps the personality is just an expression or one manifestation of sort of the larger mind.
Bei der Beschäftigung mit Nahtoderfahrungen, es sind ja verschiedene Stufen, auf denen die Menschen eine...
When it comes to working with near-death experiences, one finds that there are different stages of near-death experiences that people have. Regarding the question as to what consciousness is, especially interesting are those experiences where people report that they were merged with a larger consciousness. Experiences of fusion, for instance, with the light, which are also perceived as emergence with the divine. I was one with God and one with the universe, is what people say. And they don't mean two different things. They rather mean that God and the universe were one and the same. I was one with that.
Oder der Eckhard Wiesenhütter, der als erster in Deutschland Nahtoderfahrungen thematisiert hat.
Eckhard Wiesenhütter, the first person in Germany who addressed near-death experiences because he had them himself, explained it as follows. I was one with a higher consciousness, with something I would call love, that actually refers to this divine consciousness, which is all-encompassing and inclusive. That's how it's regularly described, as well as an all-embracing love. Whilst being in unity with this consciousness, people notice that they are part of the divine, and that this divine consciousness is mirrored in their own consciousness too.
Und in ihrem Bewusstsein sich dieses göttliche Bewusstsein auch spiegelt. Die kommen aus den Erfahrungen zurück mit einem...
They return from their experience with this feeling of connection to all people and all beings. From that perspective, one has to say that consciousness on such a level is always an openness for the totality. It is an appreciating openness. That is part of the essence of consciousness. Were one only to identify consciousness with intellect, one would not come to such a conclusion at all. But if one considers these deep near-death experiences, then the aspect of connection, unity, appreciation and love is included. That is noticeable in people who find themselves saying, well, up until this point, I didn't care about animals. I considered them as objects or commodities. Meat can be eaten and a dead animal on the street was simply annoying. Ever since I had this experience, I feel connected to those animals as well. I reflect, for instance, on whether this animal had a family and what's going to happen to its offspring now they don't have a mother anymore. Empathy is actually an expression from this consciousness. That is the way in which this all-encompassing consciousness articulates. Meditation and near-death experiences, contact through mediums, phenomena of reincarnation. Some things do indicate that consciousness is indeed possible without the brain. There is no doubt that this area offers much yet to discover for impartial researchers.
The extraordinary thing is, it's totally contrary to science. Because science is not a belief system,
right.
It's a method of inquiry.
Yes.
And if you say, well, you mustn't inquire into those things, it's not science anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that.